The first time I felt the ship breathe beneath my feet, I understood why the uninitiated whisper that an Imperial void vessel is less a construction of steel and prayer than a slumbering creature, older and hungrier than any soul pressed to serve within its labyrinthine decks. The metal groaned with a voice that seemed to remember ages long before I was born, and the air tasted of cold incense and recycled fear. Even now, as the warp presses its formless weight against the Geller field, I sense the ship listening to me, waiting to see whether I will break before it does. It is in these dim-lit corridors, lit only by trembling lumen strips and the distant glow of a failing hololith, that a single truth coils itself around my thoughts like a chain. Survival in the Imperium is rarely a matter of strength, but of how long one can endure the silence between screams. If these words reach you across the void, carried on whatever fractured Vox channel you've found, then stay with me a little longer. Share this transmission so others may know what life truly becomes in the dark between the stars, and lend your voice to ours by subscribing. Because stories like these are all that keep the void from feeling endless. Heat pressed against my skin the moment I stepped below the middeck, a suffocating cloak woven from exhaust, incense, and the breath of engines too ancient to remember their first ignition. Down here the air did not simply hang. It seized the lungs with a mechanical insistence, forcing every inhalation to feel like tribute paid to a titan that neither saw nor cared for the ones sustaining it. The walls dripped with condensation that tasted faintly of promethium vapors, and every bulkhead groaned with a sound that quivered through the metal like the pulse of something alive and dreaming in uneasy slumber. Nothing in these depths was still. Nothing was silent. Even the quiet carried its own weight of dread. The lumen strips lining the corridor flickered in arrhythmic spasms, throwing frantic shadows across the grated flooring. Those shadows did not move with the sway of the lights, but with a deliberate hesitation, as though testing their own boundaries before withdrawing. Veterans of the lower decks claimed it was merely the distortion caused by fluctuating power through aging circuits. But I had already spent enough time down here to know better. The ship had moods, and even its darkness behaved according to them. My boots clanged softly against the decking as I walked, trying to maintain the careful, measured pace that all workers learned to adopt. You never rushed in the throat of the machine. Haste invited attention, and attention down here was a currency no one wished to spend. The engine thrum vibrated up my legs, settling into my bones until it replaced my heartbeat, steady and implacable. It was impossible to forget that countless decks above us lay the sanctified chambers, where officers and nobles drifted through perfumed air and polished corridors. But this place, this furnace-lit cavern of metal sinew and tangled pipes, was where the true labor of the vessel screamed and bled. I rounded the corner into the arterial conduit that fed directly toward the reactor spine. The temperature climbed sharply, searing the exposed edges of my gloves. Sacred oils had been smeared thickly across the steel in layered streaks, some fresh and glistening, others half-melted and mingling with grime in dark rivulets that clung to the bulkheads. Each smear carried the faint scent of copper and incense, marking where tech adepts had prayed desperately for failing systems to hold another cycle. The bulkheads absorbed those prayers like they absorbed everything else, their stained surfaces almost organic in the shimmer of the stuttering lights. Ahead, a cluster of workers moved with rigid efficiency, their eyes lowered, their faces expressionless beneath the sheen of sweat. None looked at one another. None dared glance toward the dark pockets between conduits, where coolant fog curled like the searching fingers of something that had long ago stopped pretending to be part of the machinery. When a vent groaned overhead, they all flinched in perfect synchronicity. Down here, instinct ruled long before logic had a chance. I had been assigned to assist Loran again, a man whose reputation preceded him in ways that unsettled even the officers. His body bore the marks of hard service, pressure scars across his throat, burns etched along one forearm, and a limping gait from some injury he never bothered explaining. But his eyes, sharp, gray, watchful, registered every creak in the deck, every shift in temperature, every flicker of failing lumens. To him, the ship was not a vessel, but a predator he had learned to survive through cautious respect. He nodded as I approached, his face hidden behind a respirator mask etched with the faint trace of old devotional script. "Pressure shift in the secondary coolant veins," he said, voice rasping through the Vox grill. "We'll need to inspect manually." Manual inspection in these regions was a sentence handed only to the desperate or the unlucky. Cogitator arrays here frequently misreported readings, and servitors dispatched to check them returned corrupted or not at all. The engineers insisted it was nothing more than data fragmentation from long-term strain, but the crew whispered of other causes that crept through conduits in the dark and left shapes burned into steel that no machine spirit would claim. We entered the maintenance shaft, crawling on hands and knees as the ceiling pressed down inches above our helmets. Condensation pattered softly from overhead pipes, coating our gloves in a thin film that made every surface slick. The air tasted of copper and coolant, biting cold despite the raging heat deeper in the engines. As we crawled, the hum around us shifted into a lower register, vibrating the metal through our elbows and knees until it felt like crawling across the ribcage of some buried beast. Loran tapped my arm before we emerged onto the grated walkway overlooking the coolant reclamation pit. The chamber yawned before us, vast and cavernous, its ceiling lost behind layers of steam that drifted like pale ghosts above the churning reservoir. Lumens swung from sagging cables, their uncertain glow rippling across the surface of the swirling coolant. Every few moments, a plume of vapor burst upward from the pipes feeding into the reservoir, casting the walkways into momentary shadow. It felt like walking through the exhalation of some unseen colossus. We made our way carefully across the walkway, our boots clanging dimly against the steel mesh. The coolant surged below, bubbling with slow, oppressive lethargy. The surface shimmered with reflected light, though the color seemed subtly wrong. Too dark, too opaque, as though something beneath the surface drank the light rather than mirrored it. Loran stiffened suddenly, motioning for silence. Ahead, the railing had been warped outward, twisted apart like soft clay by enormous force. Globules of coolant clung to the sharp edges, still dripping, still steaming. Whatever had passed through here had done so recently, within minutes, perhaps seconds. I swallowed hard, feeling the dryness in my throat despite the humidity of the chamber. "What could have done that?" Loran did not answer. His gaze was fixed on the deck beneath the torn railing, where the steel bore fresh gouges. Clean, deep, intentional. They ran in parallel lines, too evenly spaced to be accidental damage from falling equipment or pressure bursts. The metal curled upward around each mark, as though something had carved its way across the walkway, with claws hot enough to melt steel. My breath fogged the inside of my mask. The air temperature around the gouges was lower than the rest of the chamber, a creeping cold that sank into my bones. Even the usual engine thrum seemed to distort, warping into an uneven pulse that made the hairs along my spine rise. Something hissed below the walkway. Not the hiss of coolant, not steam. Something wetter, slower, more deliberate. Loran stepped back. His hand drifted instinctively toward the cutting torch at his belt, though he didn't lift it. He knew, just as I did, that it would have been worthless against anything that could walk through this chamber unburned. "Stay behind me," he murmured. We retreated from the center of the pit, keeping our eyes fixed ahead, refusing to give the shadows the satisfaction of seeing our backs. Every shift of steam resembled movement. Every flicker of lumen seemed to reveal a shape that vanished when looked at directly. Twice I thought I saw elongated appendages sliding between the pipes above. Once I could have sworn something beneath the coolant pressed against the surface, distorting it as though yearning to rise. By the time we reached the tunnel entrance again, the air had warmed slightly. The lumens steadied. The hum of the engines returned to its normal rhythm. But the memory of those gouges stayed carved into my mind with greater precision than the steel itself. We crawled back through the maintenance shaft, though this time the space felt impossibly narrower, as though the walls pressed closer with each meter. When we finally emerged into the arterial corridor again, the other workers barely glanced at us. Yet I saw the subtle shifts in their expressions. They recognized the tightness in Loran's jaw, the tremble in my hands. They understood without asking. Down here, terror traveled faster than rumors. Shift cycles blurred over the next few days, each marked by increasingly bizarre occurrences. Tools appeared in places no one had carried them. Pressure doors cycled open without commands. Cogitator screens spat out strings of machine script so scrambled that even the engine seers avoided interpreting them. One rotation, the coolant level spontaneously equalized after hours of malfunction warnings. Yet none of the valves had moved. Another, a worker, vanished between two checkpoints only 50 meters apart. His boots were found neatly placed beside the main conduit, as though he had carefully removed them before stepping into the dark. The officers blamed incompetence. The workers blamed the ship. For my part, I began noticing small distortions in the air around corners, like heat haze but moving against the flow of the vents. Sometimes I heard footsteps behind me when no one walked there. Once, as I performed a circuit inspection alone, a whisper brushed the edge of my hearing. Not words, not sound, more like intention. Loran grew restless, pacing our workspace with a tension that bordered on panic. He marked each corridor before entering, tracing fragments of old survival liturgies along the walls. Once, I caught him glancing toward the ceiling as though expecting it to open its metal jaws and swallow us. "You feel it too," he said one cycle, as we sat sharing recaf that tasted like rust and dread. The shift, the throat tightening. I nodded, though I wished I could deny it. Something about the ship was changing, stretching its metal sinews into shapes that felt less mechanical and more aware. The throat seemed to breathe differently now, its pulses slower, deeper, more focused. Even the servitors seemed agitated, their blank eyes sweeping the corridors as though searching for something they could not identify. Our next assignment brought the inevitable turning point. A localized power fluctuation had been detected near an auxiliary reactor junction, and we were ordered to investigate. As we approached the sector, my skin prickled beneath my gear. The corridor ahead was bathed not in the usual flickering orange lumens, but in a faint violet glow that bled into the metal walls like bruising. The air felt colder with each step, until my breath escaped in pale clouds that drifted upward in unnatural spirals. Loran halted, his face paling beneath the respirator. "That color is not from our systems." Before we could retreat, the vox bead in my ear crackled sharply, then fell into static. Behind the interference, buried beneath the distortion, I heard a whisper. Soft, deliberate, unmistakably forming my name. A name spoken in a tone that tugged at memory, like a voice I once knew echoed by something hollow. I ripped the bead from my ear. The whisper didn't stop. It drifted from deeper in the corridor. Lauren seized my sleeve, wordlessly pulling me backward. We turned to flee, but the corridor behind us had darkened, the lumens extinguished. The hum of machinery changed again, deepening into a resonant growl that vibrated the plating. Somewhere in the dark ahead, metal scraped, slowly, rhythmically. Something moved toward us. We backed away, slow and measured, refusing to break into a run. Running was prey behavior. Running marked you as chosen. The scraping drew nearer, each drag of metal on metal echoing through the corridor like the stride of something enormous yet deliberate. Steam curled from vents in shivering bursts, and in the thin wisps of violet light, the shadows writhed with the suggestion of limbs that moved in patterns no human gait could mimic. When we finally crossed the threshold into the familiar flicker of orange lumens again, the sound stopped abruptly. The corridor behind us lay empty. No movement, no footprints, only silence so heavy it felt intentional. But the far wall bore fresh gouges, the same pattern we'd seen in the reclamation pit. And this time, they spelled something closer to a warning than damage. Lauren exhaled shakily. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until my lungs screamed for air. We left the sector at once, though the officers refused to record our report. They dismissed the violet lights as power bleeding from a misaligned converter, the whispers as auditory hallucination from coolant exposure, the gouges as stress fractures. Lauren said nothing in response. His silence was more damning than any argument. That cycle, sleep refused to come. Each time I closed my eyes, I felt something pacing at the edge of my bunk. The ventilation above rattled softly, as though brushed by limbs too many to count. The engine hum lowered once again, vibrating through the deck and into my bones like a voice clearing its throat. The throat of the machine was preparing to speak, and something within it had begun to listen. Ration chits weighed more than metal when the shortages began. Their stamped sigils, once little more than reminders of obligation, now felt like lifelines clutched between trembling fingers. The officers insisted the supply strain was minimal, that our current trajectory through the warp demanded temporary cutbacks, that the ship would rebalance in due time. But the lower decks felt the truth long before the data slates carried any official declaration. You could taste scarcity in the air, a dryness that clung to the tongue and hollowed the stomach even after a full meal. Of course, no one in the throat had eaten a full meal in cycles. Even the nutrient gruel had thinned, its texture approaching the viscosity of Rissic water as the servitors diluted it further each day. And the workers, hardened, weary, desperate, began to look at one another the way cornered creatures study their surroundings for weaknesses, as though survival itself had narrowed into the smallest question. Who will endure when the ship forgets to feed its own? It began with vanishing ration containers. Entire crates that should have been locked behind triple-sealed bulkheads simply ceased to exist between one shift and the next. The officers blamed smuggling. The workers blamed sabotage. But a deeper fear crept silently from bunk to bunk, whispering of darker explanations. Crates do not simply dissolve. Locks do not unfasten themselves. And no one aboard could explain why the missing supplies left no trace, not even a scrap of wrappings or a dent in the plating where a box might have fallen. It was as if the ship had opened its metal mouth and swallowed the food whole. Every cycle, more workers came to the refectory with hollow cheeks and vacant stares, their bodies thin, their movements slowed by exhaustion that sleep could not ease. Even the children born on the lower decks, those small, pale ghosts who wandered the aisles collecting scraps for their families, began to fade into quieter versions of themselves. Their laughter disappeared first, then their energy. Eventually, some simply stopped appearing. Rumors spread the way mold does in damp corners unseen. Some said the officers were hoarding food for the upper decks. Others spoke of Skitarii patrols confiscating supplies for reasons not disclosed. But the most disquieting theory grew not from suspicion of man, but from fear of the vessel. Workers claimed to hear chewing sounds beneath the floor panels, subtle yet strangely rhythmic, as if something gnawed at the mechanical entrails of the ship in search of sustenance. A few swore they saw the grating bow inward, as though under pressure from below, dents forming in the steel only to flatten themselves by the next cycle. Nothing so overt as destruction, just the suggestion of hunger expressed in metal. Loran dismissed the wildest claims with a tired shake of his head, though I noticed the way his fingers twitched when anyone spoke of noises beneath the deck plates. "Ships make sounds," he said, though there was no conviction behind it. "Stress fractures, ventilation shifts, expansion and contraction. Don't let your mind invent danger." But even he could not explain the new tension that threaded through the ship like a tightening wire. The hum we'd once known as a constant companion now carried strange fluctuations. Sometimes it rose into a thin, high whine that scraped the nerves. Other times it dropped so low the deck vibrated as if struggling to contain the pressure within. And always, wandering through those changes, came that silent question none of us dared voice aloud. Was the ship breathing differently because something inside it was starving? We were assigned to re-inspect the reclamation pit sensors after another coolant reading spike. The officers insisted it was a simple malfunction. But when Loran and I arrived, the lumens along the upper pipes flickered in a pattern that did not resemble any known power fluctuation. Their burn cycles pulsed like a heartbeat, steady, deliberate, slow. Steam drifted upward in coiling tendrils, and the air carried the unmistakable scent of something organic decaying nearby. Loran stopped. "Do you smell that?" I nodded. The odor was faint, barely perceptible, but enough to coat the back of the throat with a metallic tang, reminiscent of dried blood. We advanced cautiously along the walkway, the coolant churning below us in sluggish rolls. Something about its movement seemed different, less reactive to the surrounding machinery, more attuned to something beneath it. As we rounded the far edge of the pit, we found the source of the smell. A body lay wedged between the support struts under the walkway, or what remained of a body. The torso had been torn open, ribs cracked outward like brittle claws. The limbs were intact, but twisted as though the bones inside had liquefied. The face was unrecognizable, not merely damaged, blurred, as though something had pulled the flesh in multiple directions until it lost definition. The worst part was not the violence. It was the emptiness inside, no organs, no blood, no trace of anything that had once made the corpse human. Just a hollow shell, folded neatly as though whatever had devoured him had done so with meticulous purpose. Loran crouched beside the body, hesitated, then reached toward the chest cavity with a gloved hand. He withdrew a moment later, fingers shaking. "Dry," he murmured. "He's been drained. Completely." "But how?" He cut me off with a look sharp enough to silence. "We leave, now." We reported the corpse immediately. Officers arrived 20 minutes later, escorted by 2 servitors whose augmetic limbs clacked against the flooring with an unnerving precision. The officers examined the body. They took no samples. They issued no warnings. When asked, they claimed the worker had suffered a catastrophic pressure wound caused by coolant compressor failure. No one believed them, especially when the body was removed without a stretcher, carried by the servitors as casually as scrap metal. That cycle, sleep was scarce. The sounds beneath the deck seemed louder, the scraping more impatient, the low thrum of the engines broken by sudden lurches in the power grid. Several lumens across the sleeping quarters blew out in synchronized bursts, showering sparks that danced along the floor before dying into the shadows. I felt something brush the back of my hand during the night, a feathery, skittering movement that vanished as soon as my eyes snapped open. I told myself it must have been a loose thread or a drifting strand of insulation, but something inside me whispered otherwise. The hunger beneath the deck plates was learning patience. The next cycles brought new disappearances. A pair of workers sent to repair a vent jam never returned. Their tools were discovered near the mouth of the shaft, but there were no footprints inside the dust-lined tunnel. It was as though they had walked toward the vent and dissolved into the air before reaching it. Another crewman vanished from the muster line, the worker standing next to him, swearing that one moment the man was there, and the next he was not. The officers instructed the crew to stop spreading rumors. They updated the roster with temporary transfers, but the terrified expressions of those who'd witnessed the vanishings could not be explained away so easily. The water recyclers began to fail shortly after. Not catastrophically, just enough to tint the water a pale gray and give it a sour, metallic flavor. Filters overloaded faster than usual, clogging with substances that the tech adepts refused to identify. They worked with frantic intensity, chanting harsh machine prayers as they scraped at the residue accumulating within the purification tanks. According to the engine seers, the material did not match any industrial waste produced aboard the ship. Organic, one whispered to Loran, when he thought no one else was listening. The next day, that adept was reassigned away from the lower decks. During a shift in the coolant artery, Loran and I encountered a sound I will never forget. It began faintly, like the rumble of distant machinery misaligned, but it grew as we approached the narrow passage leading to the pressure regulators. The sound was rhythmic, heavy, and punctuated by wet, tearing noises that made my stomach twist. It reminded me of feeding, slow, deliberate feeding, a creature savoring its meal. We froze at the mouth of the passage. Loran lifted a hand, not daring to whisper. The lumen behind us flickered once, then steadied. And in that moment of stillness, the sound ceased. Not tapered off, not faded. It stopped with sudden, absolute precision. Something had heard us. Loran backed away slowly, motioning me to follow. His eyes were wide behind the respirator lenses, reflecting the dim glow of the emergency lights. We returned to the artery without looking back, though my imagination conjured shapes emerging from that corridor with every step we took. When we reached the main deck again, Loran leaned against the bulkhead, trembling beneath his gear. "It was feeding," he whispered, barely audible. "Emperor, help us. Something is feeding." "What do you think it—" He silenced me with a sharp gesture. "Do not ask questions you don't want answered. Not down here." Rations were cut further in the following cycles. Lines grew longer. Fights broke out. One worker stabbed another over a half-spilled grain pack. The man survived but was dragged away by officers and never returned to the bunkhouse. Whispers claimed the officers feared infection from contact with the blood, as though the violence itself carried some unseen contamination. The hunger beneath the decks grew bolder, manifesting not only in vanishings, but in alterations to the ship itself. Walls shifted subtly, as though the placement of pipes and access hatches no longer matched the layout stored in the cogitators. A corridor that once led to a maintenance room now opened into an entirely different chamber. A vent that had always blown warm air began to exhale cold, damp breaths that smelled faintly of rot. During one inspection shift, Loran and I found a section of deck plate bulging upward. The metal was warm. Something pulsed faintly beneath it. When Loran knelt and pressed his glove against the surface, The pulse stopped instantly, as if responding to his presence. He jerked his hand back, color draining from his face. "We're standing on it," he said. "Whatever it is, it's beneath us." In the following cycles, the vanishings accelerated. Entire groups of workers disappeared from the maintenance tunnels. Some rooms remained locked from the inside even when officers attempted to override the mechanism. When the hatches were finally forced open, the rooms were empty, completely empty, with no bedding, no personal items, no debris. Nothing remained to show that men and women had ever slept or breathed or lived inside those walls. It was Lauren who finally voiced what the rest of us feared to think. "It's feeding on more than flesh," he said as we sat near the coolant exchangers, recaf cups untouched in our trembling hands. "It's feeding on presence, on existence. It's stripping people away as though erasing them from memory." He gestured toward the crew around us. "Look at them. Do you see gaps? People you remember who no one else mentions anymore? Names missing from rosters that no one recalls correctly? It's not just feeding. It's consuming the idea of them." I thought he was exaggerating, until I tried to remember the face of a worker I'd spoken to only cycles earlier. A woman with dark hair. Or perhaps she'd been fair. Her eyes had been gray or green, or something else entirely. I remembered her speaking to me about her brother, but I couldn't recall his name. Or hers. Or whether she'd ever actually existed at all. My breathing tightened. Lauren watched me with pity. "We must not lose ourselves," he said. "Not yet." On the cycle, everything changed. The ship fell silent. Not literally. The engines still roared, the coolant still surged, the vents still wheezed. But beneath all that noise, a deeper silence resonated, one so profound that it felt like standing in the center of an enormous heartbeat that had paused mid-throb. The hunger beneath the deck plates was no longer hiding. It was waiting. And something told me that the next time it moved, the lower decks would not survive the shift. The silence that descended upon the ship following the vanishings felt less like the absence of sound and more like the tightening of an unseen grip. Even the roar of the engines, always the constant heartbeat of our existence, seemed muffled beneath a tension that vibrated through every deck plate. It was as though the vessel itself held its breath, listening to something approaching through the warp. The crew moved carefully, their steps slower, their eyes darting toward every shadow. Conversations died before they began, replaced by glances filled with unspoken dread. Fear settled over the lower decks, not as panic, but as resignation. The quiet acceptance of those who sensed a noose tightening, but could not discern its rope. The officers finally summoned Lauren and me to the upper levels for inspection duty. That alone was enough to raise concern. Lower deck workers were seldom called beyond their assigned stratum, unless a crisis spilled upward and threatened the chain of command. As we ascended through the lifts, slow, shuddering platforms that creaked with every meter, we rose from the stifling heat of the engine decks into cold sterility. The air felt cleaner, though still tainted by the faint tang of recycled ozone. The lumens here burned steadier, but their bright white glow did not bring comfort. For the first time, I noticed the absence of certain crew in the corridors above, too. Officers whose voices once echoed down the hallways, adjutants who had barked orders during drills, navigational clerks who once cluttered the main passageways with data slates and arguments. Gaps appeared in conversations when their names were nearly spoken, then quickly swallowed under uneasy silence. When we reached the command level, the atmosphere shifted again. The lighting dimmed, not from malfunction, but from intention. The walls bore banners depicting the sigils of authority, and incense burners hung from steel frames, exhaling coils of scented smoke that curled around our boots. Vox units whispered with coded chatter, carrying messages we could not interpret. 2 armed sentries stood at the entrance to the captain's strategium. Their armor was polished, their expressions blank behind their visors, but their postures betrayed strain. Even they felt the ship's unease. The strategium itself was a cavernous chamber encircled by hololithic arrays. Normally, these would be filled with star charts, fleet schematics, and warp path projections. Instead, they flickered with corrupted imagery, icons distorting into jagged sigils that no mortal lexicon had ever recorded. Sections of the displays trembled as if reacting to unseen pressure, collapsing into static before rebuilding themselves in fractured patterns. A sense of imminent collapse permeated the space, like a storm gathering behind a veil. At the center stood the captain. I had seen him only twice before, once during our first muster cycle, when he addressed the crew with the distant authority of a man carved from ice, and once during a disciplinary decree that sent workers trembling into compliance. Now the man seemed diminished, as though the ship's tension had seeped into his bones. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of his coat, and deep grooves lined his face, carved by sleepless nights and impossible decisions. His eyes, though still sharp, burned with something between fury and despair. Loran bowed stiffly. I followed, though my gaze flickered toward the hololithic screens again. For an instant, one display stabilized, revealing a map of the vessel's warp trajectory. But the outline wavered, bending inward like a mouth curling into a sneer. I blinked, and the image dissolved into static. "You've been summoned," the captain said, his voice brittle but commanding, "because the lower decks are slipping from our control." Loran stiffened. "Sir, with respect, they are not slipping. They are being taken." A tense silence filled the strategium. One of the officers flanking the captain shifted uneasily, but the captain lifted a hand to silence him. "Taken," he repeated quietly, as though tasting the word. "That is a dangerous claim." "It is the truth," Loran replied. "Workers vanish, supplies vanish. Entire sections of the ship reshape themselves like metal under heat. Something moves beneath the deck plates, feeding, and whatever it is, command has lost control of it." The captain's jaw clenched. His hand tightened around the hilt of his ceremonial blade, a gesture not of threat, but of restraint. "We are aware of the disappearances," he said. "We are aware of the structural anomalies, but if word spreads that something hunts the crew from within the ship, panic will cripple us, and panic down here kills faster than any beast." Loran stepped forward, ignoring the guards tensing at the motion. "Sir, panic is already growing. If you do nothing, it will ignite like spilled promethium. What is feeding on this ship will not stop at the lower decks." The captain's gaze fell to the hololiths. The distorted projections shifted into shapes that looked almost like mouths, gaping voids ringed with teeth of static. He exhaled slowly. "The warp is pressing against us," he murmured. "Harder than usual. Every reading from the Geller field projectors has degraded. We are losing stability. The Navigator reports pressure waves in the tides of the void moving with unnatural intent." He turned to us again. "This vessel is hunted." A chill crept through my spine. "By what?" He gave a hollow laugh. "If we knew, it could be fought. But the warp is full of things that mimic hunger and intention. Some test the hull for weaknesses. Some slip inside, wearing the shape of shadows. Even the machine spirit can be twisted if starved of proper rites." Loran's eyes hardened. "You think this entity is a warp intrusion?" "I think," the captain said slowly, "that something has found a way to hollow us from the inside, and our options diminish with every hour." The strategium doors shut with a resonance that echoed like a judgment. The captain gestured for us to follow him deeper into the chamber, toward a reinforced alcove shielded by metal sigils and prayer script. Inside hung a Vox relay panel, its casing cracked, its interior circuitry tangled like veins. The Vox grill emitted a faint static hiss. "This," the captain said, "is why you were summoned." He pressed a rune. The static sharpened. Then, words emerged, fragmented, faint, and unmistakably spoken by a human voice, or what had once been one. "Hun, great, be, low, calm, ing." The voice dissolved into a wet whisper, like breath moving through a throat half filled with fluid. Loran's face paled behind his respirator. "Who recorded that?" "No one," the captain said. "This transmission began 3 cycles ago. Origin unknown. It echoes through every relay we attempt to shut down. It overrides all encryption. It only repeats when the ship enters a quiet phase. And every time it speaks, something else vanishes." I felt the air thicken, my breath catching as though the ship's walls pressed inward. "You want us to do something about this," Loran said quietly. "I want you," the captain answered, "to confirm whether the threat is internal. If so, we must contain it before morale collapses. You know the lower decks better than anyone still alive." Still alive. 2 words that landed heavier than any command. We were dismissed with strict orders to investigate the reactor crawl spaces and the areas surrounding the Geller field conduits. As we left the strategium, I glanced back at the hololiths. For a brief moment, the static cleared enough to reveal a silhouette human-shaped but impossibly elongated, hovering at the ship's prow. Its head turned as if noticing me. Then the image distorted, fracturing into meaningless symbols. The corridor outside felt colder than before. We returned to the lower decks with a small escort, 2 security officers armed with shock pikes and a servo skull programmed to map abnormalities in the conduits. The skull's optical lens flickered as it drifted ahead, its auspex array sweeping the passage with soft clicking sounds that reminded me uncomfortably of insect mandibles. The first hours of inspection revealed nothing unusual, nothing beyond the perpetual wrongness that had already taken root within the ship. Pipes moaned under invisible strain. Deck plates shivered without provocation. The lumens flickered in a pattern that made the shadows dance like starved figures clawing at the walls. The 2 officers tried to mask their unease, but their hands tightened on their shock pikes with every new corridor. Then the servo skull halted. Its lens shone bright red. The auspex began clicking rapidly, then irregularly, as though its logic processes struggled to interpret the signals. Ahead lay the approach to one of the auxiliary Geller conduits, a narrow tunnel lined with metal ribs that arched overhead like the throat of a predatory creature. The temperature dropped sharply as we approached. Frost formed along the walls, sparkling like tiny shards of glass. Our breath fogged. Loran raised his lantern. "Something is wrong. This conduit should be warm." The servo skull drifted further, scanning the frost-covered walls. Its auspex emitted a rising whine. Then, without warning, it detonated. A flash of white light filled the corridor, followed by a burst of shrapnel. I shielded my face as fragments of bone and metal clattered against the deck. When the smoke cleared, the skull's remains lay scattered across the corridor like the broken husk of a crushed insect. The officers stared in horror. "What could overload a servo skull like that?" one whispered. Loran's voice trembled. "Something that doesn't want to be seen." We moved forward, though every instinct screamed to flee. The frost thickened. The lumens dimmed further until the corridor glowed only faintly beneath our lantern. Ahead, shapes hung from the ceiling, dark lumps suspended by strands of congealed fluid. I approached cautiously. They were ration crates, or what had once been ration crates, Their surfaces were warped inward, crushed as though by enormous jaws. The contents had been drained entirely, leaving only dry husks. Dozens of them hung like grotesque fruit. But that was not what made my blood freeze. Beneath the crates lay footprints, human footprints, except they were elongated, twisted, the toes stretched into claw-like shapes. They trailed deeper into the conduit. The officers stepped back. "Sir, we cannot go in there." Loran swallowed, shaken to his core. "We must. If we turn back now, whatever this is will reach the bridge next." We advanced. Every step creaked with unbearable slowness. The footprints grew fresher. The air grew colder. The frost on the walls formed patterns, swirls and sigils that looked disturbingly like eyes watching us. Then, ahead, the corridor opened into a chamber I had never seen on any schematic. A circular room, vast, with a ceiling that arched into darkness. In its center pulsed a massive gland-like structure embedded directly into the hull. Wires, pipes, and veins, yes, veins, ran from it like roots. The conduits around it throbbed. It was beating, slowly, rhythmically, with intent. "What is that?" one officer gasped. "It shouldn't exist," Loran whispered. "This chamber, this organ, it isn't part of the ship." A low groan reverberated through the walls, so deep it made our bones vibrate. The gland pulsed faster, as though sensing our presence. Then something stepped from behind it. A shape. Tall. Gaunt. Human-shaped but impossibly stretched, its limbs too long, its joints bending wrong. Its skin, or what resembled skin, was slick and pale, stretched thin over bone-like ridges. Its head tilted with unnatural curiosity, its eyes black voids that reflected no light. The officers screamed. One raised his shock pike and charged. The creature moved faster than thought. One moment the officer was rushing forward, the next he hung limp in the creature's grasp. His body drained of blood in seconds. The creature dropped him like an empty container. Loran grabbed my arm. "Run!" We sprinted blindly, the creature's footsteps echoing behind us, soft, deliberate, too close. The lumens flickered violently. The corridor seemed to stretch and twist. I felt breath on my neck that was not mine. We reached the artery junction just as the creature lunged. Loran slammed the emergency hatch. The gate sealed with a boom that shook the corridor. A screech echoed from the other side, a wailing, hungry cry that rattled the walls. The officers were gone. The gland-like chamber was still pulsing behind the hatch. Something had taken root in the ship. Something alive. Something starving. When we returned to the Strategium, our report was met with silence. The captain listened. His expression hardened with every word. Finally he spoke, voice low. "This ship is dying." He turned toward the hololithic displays. They flickered again, showing the elongated silhouette once more. "This creature," he murmured, "this hunger, it is not an intruder." He looked at us. "It is becoming part of us." His next words were quieter still. "And to save this vessel, a price must be paid." He did not yet say what price, but the dread in his eyes told me he already knew, and that whatever he decided would haunt the ship long after the creature finished its next meal. The warp pressed against the hull with a weight that felt almost human in its insistence, as if some immense presence leaned close enough to feel the tremor of our breaths through the steel. Every deck felt thinner, stretched taut by a tension no mortal engineer could diagram or quantify. The air itself had grown heavy, carrying a taste like ionized dust and old incense, lingering after a forgotten ritual. Crew drifted through the corridors like figures in a half-remembered dream, speaking softly, walking slowly, listening for sounds they could not name. And beneath it all, the ship quivered, not in malfunction, but in anticipation. After the encounter in the conduit chamber, news moved like fever through the lower decks, slipping through bunkhouses and engine shrines in murmured fragments. No one spoke openly of the creature, or the pulsing gland embedded in the hull, but whispers carried their own shapes. People spoke of shadows that moved against the direction of lumen flicker, of reflections that lagged half a heartbeat behind their owners, of soft knocks echoing through the plating as though something beneath the deck plates tapped a message against the metal. Others swore the air shifted with unfamiliar scents, ozone mixed with ancient dust, or the sweetness of incense burnt long before human lungs had drawn breath. But the most unsettling change was not physical, it was spiritual. Crew began offering unfamiliar prayers during shift rotations. Their litanies felt older than the ship, older than the Imperium, as though dredged from memories they should not possess. Workers muttered about visions they witnessed in the reflection of coolant pools, visions of armored figures standing sentinel in silent halls, their golden silhouettes shimmering like phantoms. Some claimed to see custodians drifting through the shadows, heads bowed, hands resting on weapons of unfathomable craft. Others spoke of glimpsing radiant figures at the far ends of the corridors, their forms dissolving into motes of golden light before the lumen strips flickered back to stability. I dismissed these tales at first as hunger-driven madness. After all, deprivation gnawed at us with a ferocity nearly as terrifying as the creature in the conduits. But then the visions came for me. It happened during a routine inspection of the reactor artery, where the noise was loud enough to drown out one's thoughts. Steam curled through the vents, twisting like pale serpents across the pathway. As I stared into the drifting haze, the shadows shifted, subtly at first, then with deliberate intent. A shape materialized through the vapor, enormous, still, unmoving. Its presence radiated gravitas, an aura so profound my breath stilled. Its armor shimmered gold, brighter than the lumen strips, yet muted as if seen through a veil of ancient memory. A spear, taller than I, glistened faintly in its grip, though the details blurred like an image glimpsed underwater. For a long, trembling moment, it did nothing, just watched, just existed. Then, with a slow inclination of its head, as though acknowledging something it recognized in me, the figure dissolved back into the steam. When the vision vanished, the artery felt colder than before. My legs shook. My lungs refused to draw a steady breath. I stumbled back from the walkway, leaning against a bulkhead slick with condensation, trying to convince myself the apparition had been a hallucination. But the memory of that gaze lingered. Measured, knowing, heavy with unspoken judgment. I said nothing of this to Loran at first, afraid he would believe I'd broken beneath the strain. But the moment he saw my face during the next rotation, his expression hardened. "You saw something," he said softly, almost accusingly. "I don't know what I saw." "You saw something." He guided me away from the other workers, toward a quiet alcove near the coolant exchangers, where the noise drowned out eavesdroppers. Only when we were alone did he speak again. "You saw a figure." I froze. "How do you know?" "Because others have seen them too." The words struck like cold iron. I stared at him, waiting for explanation, but he hesitated, glancing down the corridor as though expecting something to materialize from the shadows. "All of this, the vanishings, the feeding, the warping of the ship, it's changing the warp flow around us. When a vessel drifts too close to turbulence, the minds aboard begin to slip, grasping at fragments of things they were never meant to witness. Some see nightmares. Others, if they're fortunate, see visions of faith." "You think that figure was a hallucination?" Loran's gaze locked with mine, tired, hollow, but certain. "I think," he said, What you saw is what the warp wanted you to see, or what your soul reached for in desperation. He leaned closer. Or what watches us when mortal eyes grow weak. The next cycles only deepened the strangeness. Vox relays crackled with messages that should not exist. Half prayers, half screams, spoken in voices that never matched any crewman aboard. Data slates flickered with lines of text that vanished when touched. Pressure readings fluctuated without mechanical cause, and more crew began reporting visions, not just of armored figures, but of brilliant light pouring through non-existent cracks in the hull, illuminating the corridors with hues of impossible radiance. Some called it the Astronomican's reflection. Some called it madness. Some whispered that the Emperor himself was watching. No one agreed on origin, but all agreed on one truth. The visions brought a strange, fleeting clarity, and something else heard them. One cycle during mid-shift, a cry of alarm erupted from the east corridor. Workers ran toward the noise, their steps frantic. Lauren and I followed, pushing through the gathering crowd until we reached the source. A worker stood rigid beneath a lumen strip, his face bathed in pale white light. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, shimmering faintly as though reflecting a distant sun. His hands twitched at his sides, fingers spasming in erratic patterns. The air around him felt charged, humming with faint static. When Lauren touched his shoulder, the worker convulsed and spoke. Not in his own voice, not in anything human. The words emerged in a cadence that felt liturgical yet distorted, as though something tried to mimic ritual speech, but had forgotten how human throats formed sound. Light. The light approaches. Beneath. His body jerked. He sees through the shivering gate. Another convulsion. It feeds, because the lantern dims. His head snapped upward, his gaze fixed on something above the lumen, something none of us could see. It comes for the soul, closest to forgetting. Then his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed. When we lifted him, we realized he was not unconscious. He was empty, alive, breathing, but hollow, as though the substance of his existence had been drawn out, leaving only a fragile shell that clung to the last threads of awareness. The officers declared him psychically compromised and removed him from the deck. But workers whispered of something else, that he had been touched by a presence neither wholly benevolent nor wholly hostile, a presence watching the ship with an interest that made human minds tremble. Those same workers began conducting their own rites, not official litanies or sanctioned hymns. These were desperate rituals pulled from memory or instinct, muttered while lighting makeshift candles in ventilation alcoves. Some prayed for protection. Others prayed for clarity. A few prayed for swift death. The most devout whispered that the visions were warnings from the Astronomican, the great beacon guiding humanity through the warp. They claimed the strange light glimpsed in coolant reflections was a fragment of its radiance, reaching into the vessel to shield us from the hunger beneath the deck plates. Others rejected this entirely. They believed the visions were mockery, a cruelty from the warp, mimicking sacred images to lure souls into complacency. I stood between these beliefs, torn. My vision had felt real, profound even. But what if it was only a lure? What if the seeming golden figure was merely another mask worn by the thing hiding inside the ship? One cycle, while Loran and I inspected the Geller field junctions, we encountered proof that something intelligent watched us. The conduits thrummed with unstable resonance, their usual blue glow flickering in sickly green pulses. A faint humming drifted through the tunnel, a melody almost familiar, almost comforting, yet wrong in its rhythm. As we approached the primary housing unit, we found the metal walls etched with fresh markings, scratches forming spirals and geometric shapes. They radiated outward from the central panel like the lines of some complex equation. Loren ran his fingers over them. "This isn't random damage," he whispered. "It's drawing something." But who or what was writing in the ship's inner sanctum? Before we could speculate further, the lights flickered, and a soft golden radiance filled the tunnel, not bright but warm. At its center stood another vision, the same towering armored figure from the reactor artery, its spear grounded, its helm turned toward us. But this time the figure was clearer, the details sharper. Its armor glowed faintly, like sunlight reflected off ancient metal. Its presence felt protective, stern, unwavering, patient. For a moment I felt weightless, as though freed from the crushing pressure of the warp. Then the vision turned its head, not toward us, but toward something behind us, something we had not yet sensed. The golden figure raised its spear, the radiance brightened and vanished. At the same instant, a screech erupted from deep within the conduits, a shrill, hungry cry that rattled the metal. The markings on the walls pulsed as though reacting to the sound. Loren grabbed my arm. "Run!" We fled through the narrow tunnel as the screech grew louder, echoing with a desperate hunger that clawed at the spine. Shadows stretched across the walls, reaching for us with elongated fingers. The Geller conduits flickered in and out of stability, the glow dimming dangerously. By the time we reached the artery junction, the screech had echoed into distant silence. Loren leaned against the wall, gasping. It was coming. It was coming for us. "But something stopped it," I said. Loren hesitated. "Or something distracted it." That cycle, 3 more crew claimed to have seen visions, figures in gold, fragments of light, echoes of familiar hymns reverberating through the pipes. Others reported nightmares so vivid they woke bleeding from the nose. A young man in the refectory insisted he'd heard the Emperor's name whispered through the Vox grills. An older woman swore she'd glimpsed Terra through a tiny crack in the bulkhead, a vision of endless spires crowned by radiant light. Were these warnings? Were they protections? Or were they illusions woven by the thing feeding beneath us? No one knew. No one dared assume. But one thing became clear. The hunger and the visions were connected. Each appearance of golden light was followed by the disappearance of another worker. Each nightmare preceded a new anomaly in the Geller field. Each prayer for protection seemed to draw the attention of something lurking in the void just outside our understanding. Then came the night the Astronomicon itself seemed to pulse through the ship. It began with a low hum, a resonance vibrating through every deck, rattling tools and echoing through ventilation shafts. Crew collapsed to their knees, some crying, others laughing, others screaming. Lumen strips blazed white, brighter than they had ever burned. The air shimmered, filled with motes of drifting light. I saw Loren kneel beside me, eyes wide, face illuminated by a glow that made him look younger, almost peaceful. Then the motes darkened. The humming stopped, and a void black wave flooded through the ship, a psychic shock so deep it silenced thought. The motes of light shattered like glass. The lumens died. The air went cold enough to bite skin. In the choking darkness that followed, a single whisper drifted through the decks. Hungry. Not from the warp, not from the creature, from the ship itself. We felt it. We knew it. The hunger beneath the deck plates had reached a new threshold, and whatever light had flickered through the ship was not enough to stop it. Some said the visions were weakening. Others swore they were growing stronger, more desperate. The Astronomicon's distant beacon flickered through our dreams like a drowning star. But one truth loomed above all. If something holy was reaching for us, it was losing. And if something unholy hunted us, it was growing bold. The next cycle, the captain summoned us again. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, and the price he would name would change everything. The summons came without ceremony. No alarm, no Vox alert, no officer pounding at our doors. Instead, a single chime echoed down the corridors, soft enough to be mistaken for a failing lumen strip, yet precise in its rhythm. Those who heard it recognized its purpose instinctively, as though the ship itself had whispered the command directly into our bones. Lauren and I left our bunks before the second chime faded, stepping into a corridor lit only by the faint flicker of emergency lights. The air tasted stale, as though the ventilation systems no longer cared to refresh it. Shadows clung to the walls with a tenacity that suggested they had grown heavier, denser, almost alive. We made our way upward through service ladders and narrow access corridors that groaned beneath our weight. Every step felt watched, though no eyes revealed themselves. The deck plates hummed beneath our boots with a slow, deliberate pulse, as though the vessel strained to hold something within its depths. The higher we climbed, the more pronounced that pulse became. It vibrated through the ladders, through the walls, even through the air, a deep resonance that bordered on biological in its steady, ominous rhythm. When we reached the command level, the change struck immediately. The lumens that once burned steady and bright now flickered with a soft orange ghost of their former glow. Incense burners lay overturned, their embers long cold. Vox panels hissed with static, their screens bleeding distorted symbols that crawled across the glass like living script. And the guards stationed at the strategium door, usually rigid and alert, stood unnaturally still, as though frozen mid-breath. Their eyes, barely visible beneath their visors, looked glassy, unfocused. I wasn't sure they were conscious or alive. The strategium doors parted for us with a reluctant groan. Inside, the chamber was brighter than the corridors, illuminated by flickering hololithic projectors that formed unstable constellations across the air. But brightness did not mean clarity. The hololiths twisted, reforming themselves into shapes not meant for human interpretation. Coiling spirals, branching sigils, outlines of structures both mechanical and organic. They spun slowly, as if orbiting an unseen gravity well. The captain stood before them, shoulders hunched, hands gripping the railing of the central dais. He looked older than before, years older, as though the ship had drained time from him, the way it drained blood from the others. His coat, once immaculate, hung from him like a ceremonial shroud. Sweat glistened on his brow despite the chill permeating the room. "You came," he said without turning. Lauren stepped forward cautiously. "Your summons reached us, sir." The captain laughed softly, a bitter, exhausted sound. "It wasn't mine." Silence stretched. The only sound was the hum of the hololiths and the low pulse that vibrated through the deck plates. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He finally turned to face us, and the expression carved into his features was one I had never expected to see on a commanding officer in the Imperium. Terror. "The ship called you," he said, "or rather the thing inside it did. And I believe it wants you to witness what comes next." Lauren's jaw tightened. "What price must be paid?" The captain exhaled shakily and gestured toward the hololiths. "Look." The projections shifted, forming a diagram of the vessel, not as we knew it, with decks neatly layered and systems clearly mapped, but as a pulsing, organic entity. The conduits glowed like veins. The reactors thrummed like organs. The warp drive flared like a beating heart. And near the center of the vessel, where no schematic had ever placed a chamber, lay a massive, throbbing node. I recognized it instantly, the gland-like growth we had seen in the auxiliary conduit chamber. Except this depiction showed it expanded, pulsing harder, with tendrils reaching through the ship like roots burrowing into soil. It had grown. It was still growing, and the ship was letting it. "What is it?" Loran murmured. The captain shook his head slowly. "A parasite, a mutation, a warp-born cancer, a new organ. I do not know. I only know that the ship is no longer entirely ours." He stepped closer to the hololith, tracing the shape of the growth with trembling fingers. When we entered this stretch of the warp, something pressed against our Geller field. Something old, something hungry. The field held, but not perfectly. Something seeped through, a fragment perhaps, or a whisper. It found the weak places inside us. It began to grow. "And the disappearances?" I asked. The captain's voice dropped to a whisper. "Consumption. It feeds to strengthen itself." Loran leaned in, eyes narrowing. "Can it be cut out?" The captain gave a hollow smile. "If only it were flesh. If only we understood its nature. But it acts with intelligence. It adapts. It reacts. It communicates." The hololith flickered suddenly, distorting into a shape that almost resembled an eye. The captain flinched. "It speaks to the ship," he said, "through power fluctuations, through ventilation cycles, through dreams." A shiver ran down my spine. "Dreams?" He nodded slowly. "You have seen visions, have you not?" I stiffened. "Yes." "Then it knows your mind," the captain said. "It shows us what we fear, or what we long for, or what it wants us to believe." Loran's voice hardened. "What does it want?" The hololiths fractured, swirling into chaotic spirals before stabilizing into a single beating node, the parasitic heart. Then the projections zoomed outward, showing the ship drifting through the warp like a wounded creature. Tendrils of warp light coiled around it like serpent shapes, brushing against the hull with predatory patience. "It wants us alive," the captain said quietly. "Some of us, those with stronger minds, those who have seen the visions." Cold dread settled into my gut. "Why?" The captain met my gaze, and the answer in his eyes hollowed me. "To form a connection." The hololith flickered again, and a cascade of images flashed through the air, a corridor lined with shadows, a mouth opening in the deck plates, a figure of gold dissolving into dust, a black void swallowing light. "I believe," the captain whispered, "that it intends to merge with this ship fully, to turn it into its body, to use us as its nerves, its eyes, its voice." Loran's breathing quickened. "We have to destroy it." The captain shook his head. "We tried. Plasma torches fail near it. Power cells deplete instantly. Cogitators crash. Even fire refuses to burn. And every attempt to harm it, every single one, has resulted in crew disappearances within minutes." "Then we evacuate," Loran insisted. "To where?" the captain snapped. "We are adrift in the warp. The Geller field is failing. Escape pods would be devoured before ignition. Only this ship keeps us alive, and only barely. If we flee the vessel, we die. If the parasite completes its integration, we die more slowly." He descended the dais and approached us with a heavy, resolute calm. "There is one option left," he said. "One final act that may sever its connection, or at least slow its growth." Loran braced himself. "What must be done?" The captain's next words landed like a hammer blow. "The heart must be confronted, directly." Silence. Cold, absolute silence. I felt my lungs tighten. Confronted? By whom? The captain looked at us with a gaze filled with sorrow. "By those it has taken an interest in." My stomach dropped. "Us," I whispered. He nodded slowly. "It watches you, It speaks through you. It is drawing you into its awareness. If anything can disrupt its growth, it is direct interference from the minds it has marked. Loran glared at him. You're sending us to die. I'm sending you, the captain said softly, because you are the only ones it has not consumed, because your visions may allow you to survive near it longer than others, and because the ship, whatever remains of it, chose you. He gestured toward the door. A path has opened. We turned. The strategium doors were no longer closed. They had parted on their own. At the end of the corridor beyond, a faint golden light flickered, weak, unsteady, but unmistakably calling. Loran gripped my shoulder. We don't have to do this. But the truth pressed in on me as surely as the ship's pulse. If we refused, no one else would stand in our place. The creature would grow. The ship would die, and the visions, whatever their origin, had chosen us. We go, I said quietly. Before the captain could speak again, a tremor shook the ship, violent enough to knock hololiths off their mounts. Vox panels shattered. Lights burst. The floor lurched beneath our feet. A deep, resonant scream echoed through the vessel, a sound not human, not mechanical, but something between, something alive. The captain staggered but kept his footing. Hurry! We left him behind and entered the corridor. The pulse grew louder, the shadows deeper, the air thicker. The golden flicker ahead wavered, as if struggling against an encroaching darkness, as we descended through the decks, not through known corridors, but through ones that had not existed before. We saw signs of the parasite everywhere. Bulkheads bulged outward, metal veins pulsed beneath the surface, pools of dark fluid collected in corners, bubbling faintly. The walls whispered, not words, but impressions, hunger, memory, longing. At last, we reached the chamber. It was larger now, vast. A cathedral built of twisted metal and living tissue. Pipes bent like ribs overhead. Tendrils coiled across the floor like roots seeking warmth. And in the center, towering, pulsating, impossible, beat the heart. It throbbed with a rhythm that felt synchronized to my own pulse. With each beat, the walls trembled. With each beat, the air thickened. With each beat, something brushed against my mind, a cold, searching presence probing my thoughts. No sudden movements, Loran whispered. But the heart reacted anyway. It pulsed faster. Veins expanded. The whispers in my skull crescendoed into near speech. A shape rose from behind the heart, a silhouette we knew too well. The creature from the conduits. It was bigger now, its limbs elongated further, its skin stretched thin over a shifting mass beneath. Eyes of solid black fixed upon us with intent. It moved forward. Loran raised his torch, but the air around it dimmed, the flame shrinking into nothing. The creature hissed, head tilting in a grotesque mimicry of curiosity. I stumbled backward, and the golden light flickered. Above the heart, weak, fading, but unmistakably present. A figure, a silhouette of gold, not as clear as before, not as solid, but watching. The creature recoiled. The heart faltered. The air warmed. A whisper filled my ears, not from the parasite, but from the fading light. Remember. That single word struck through me like a lightning bolt. I stepped forward. The heart pulsed violently. The creature lunged, but I shouted, not in fear, but in defiance. No more. The chamber trembled. The golden light flared. And for a single instant, the parasite's rhythm faltered completely. The creature screamed, an agonized, distorted shriek, and the heart convulsed, its beat stuttering. Loran seized the moment. Together, he and I grasped the nearest vein-like conduit embedded in the floor and tore. The heart convulsed again. The chamber roared. The golden light burst. and everything went white. When I awoke, the hum of the engine surrounded me. Soft, steady, human. I lay on a cot in the medici bay, surrounded by silent servitors and flickering lumen strips. Loran sat beside me, exhausted but alive. "What happened?" I whispered. He gave a tired smile. The heart stopped beating. My breath caught. "And the creature?" "Gone," he said. "Evaporated into nothing. The ship expelled it." I sat up slowly. "And the visions?" Loran paused. "Those stopped too." But his expression wavered, just for a moment, as though he weren't fully certain, as though something still watched, as though something waited. The ship hummed around us, alive, stable, wounded, but recovering. Yet beneath that hum, I sensed one last faint, fading echo. A heartbeat. Far away, growing quieter, but not gone. Not yet.